The chandelier threw constellations across polished marble. Crystal caught idle conversation, and turned it into glitter, that floated above silver trays, and silk skirts. Men in tailored suits circled a long mahogany table, where papers lay like paralegal drafts. A thin wooden box with a carved emblem. A jade seal wrapped in crimson cloth. This was the night the Fu family presented themselves to the world. A matchmaking evening that was equal parts social theater and business assertion. Tonight, the family's choice of an heir would be discussed over champagne, and a chorus of polite applause. Somewhere in that crowd, a small bundle shifted. It made no sound anyone noticed. It was an absence of sighs. A hand, soft and perplexed, found daylight. "Dad," the child said, and the single syllable cut through the room like a blade. For a breathless second there was nothing but that child's voice and the sudden hollow it left. A server dropped a tray. Silverware skittered and clattered. Conversations froze like music at the end of a song. The jade seal at the center of the table seemed to vibrate under every gaze. He emerged from the backpack as if from a rabbit hole. Knees scraped, shirt caked with city dust, hair sticking up in modes only small boys can borrow from wind and worry. He blinked. His eyes were clear and honest. Too big for the room, and the name slipped out like a secret. He didn't know he carried Dad. The woman who had been standing near the Valleyu, carrying an easel bag, a student's canvas tote, slung across her shoulder, stiffened. Her fingers had not meant for the child to be exposed. She had made a decision 2 days ago that felt like a rope and a rope-burning thumb. She had told herself it would be temporary, that the crowd would never notice. The child had slept there on trains, in stairwells, tucked into the narrow warmth of that pack, because the world had no room for him yet. The room peered in. Gasps rose and folded into whispers. Someone laughed, an uneasy sound that pretended amusement. "Who is that?" A woman breathed. "Is that?" The question stopped short. Everywhere. Fusu was standing closest to the table. The family patriarch had spoken. A circle had closed like a net. He was tall, the kind of lean that sat at ceilings of power. When he turned, his face showed something like recognition, and a man who'd kept his hands clean, aware he'd touched something filthy. He had stepped into the Fu fortune like a suit that had been waiting for him, perfectly cut around ambition. Tonight he was the scion, whose yes could rebirth a destiny. Everyone here wanted a piece of the future he represented. His gaze slid to the small boy on the floor, and the world tilted. "Who brought him?" His voice did not rise, but it had the ability of cold water to cut attention. A dozen faces named the student by the tote, the art school volunteer roster she had signed. Accusation found a meeting point, and sat there. The student Lena, 22, an outsider, in a house built of insiders, shook, as if a winter had taken her in both hands. I didn't know. He said to hide so no one would see us, I thought." She looked at the boy, and for a second her face became a map of sleepless dedication that had no place here among marble and lineage. "He said his name is Jean." The boy repeated his name on the hushed carpet. A small thing that sounded like a painting being carefully described. Jonian. A cousin moved quick. The kind of quickness that smells of trouble. "Get a DNA test," he said, as if the weight of blood could be decided by a landlord's threat. "If he's of the Fu line, he has claims. If not, this is scandal." It was like a match set, near kindling. The assembled family looked toward the jewel in the cloth of jade sealand, then at Fusu, because hope and ruin both hung on what he might decide. A seal could be more than stone. In this house, it was a symbol, the device that tied authority to flesh. That small green disc, wrapped in red, meant shares and decisions, and an unimaginably clear line of who belonged and who did not. No one in the room pretended to be surprised by how easily a single child could refocus a room crammed with deeds and loyalty. The child crawled further out of the bag, and paused at a leather shoe. He pushed himself upright, thumb dug into the seam, and looked at the woman who had carried him at Lena. "Where's Dad?" he asked, as if the question should be answered like a math problem. Now the crowd behaved like a sea, stirred by wind. Photographers who had been planted for the evening snapped shots that would bloom into headlines. A reporter whispered into a recorder. Social connections stretched and adjusted like fishing lines. Fusio's eyes were unreadable. He stepped forward, measured. "Who brought him here?" he demanded. His voice rose, not for anger but as a line drawn in sand, official and thin. Expuren. Expuren." Lena's hands trembled. "I'm a volunteer," she said. "He followed me. I didn't want to leave him alone. I thought if I could keep him hidden just until the end, maybe no one would see." Her voice broke at the edge. "We're trying to find his mother." Fu Seo's jaw tightened. The photographer's shudders were now a rainstorm. There were murmurs about dignity, rumors about responsibilities passed like a hot potato. No one asked whether any of it had to do with a young woman who had once been an art student. The scandal wanted a face, and this boy gave it one. Someone from the Fu Council in Aunt, with nails like lacquered words, leaned forward. She had been careful for years. She had built herself on the careful. "If he claims the FU name," she said, "we must establish paternity. For the board? And for appearances? For the seal?" Lena looked as if the ground had opened and swallowed her. "Please," she whispered, "please don't make him take a test in front of everyone." A hush followed, and the child, who had watched the room like someone reading a stranger's face, reached out for the nearest person Lena had said, "Small and firm, I want Dad." In that instant, every plan that had been moving in the house shifted. The jade seal's cloth seemed a little heavier. Fusio felt a weight press, where decisions nested inside his chest. He had learned to silence personal tremors. The family relied on him for that. But while he looked like the kind of man who kept his costs in the black, inside something old and stubborn tugged. The memory of a thinner apartment, of the smell of oil paint and tea, of a small hand on his coat the night he had left. Someone murmured about ancestry, about rights, about the ledger that dictated who received what. Another voice asked whether the child's mother would claim the seal. More hands reached for the papers. The room was no longer just a ballroom. It had become a courtroom in which a small boy's breath was evidence. A staff member moved to bring in a doctor, or a nurse, or someone who could take a hair sample with ceremony. A lawyer, who always smelled faintly of citrus and cheap determination, set a plate down with cotton gloves and an affidavit. No one in the room considered whether this was humane for the child. The spectacle would make a statement one way or another. Lena wrapped the boy's arms around her and tried to stand. He clung as if he had found a harbor. The photographers blinked in that moment, shocked by tenderness. A cousin stepped forward. "If he's a fool, this affects the will," he said. "It affects the distribution." The letters' numbers laid themselves across the room like a shadow. Fusu did not answer. He looked at the child again, the name in his mouth like a shape he had not meant to use. Across his forehead there was a line the family had not been permitted to read. Uncertainty that had nothing to do with documents, and everything to do with a life he had walked away from. "Stay fu," Susu said at last, softer than the air cooled by the air conditioners. "No tests tonight. We will talk privately." It was an order that protected and postponed. It put the boy into a line of waiting. Lena exhaled, like someone released from a short prison. The crowd unfurled into a background murmur, and the photographers backed away, the predators finding other blood. The boy looked up at Fusu, bright-eyed, hope like a rope ladder. "Are you my dad?" His voice was a small plea. Fusio's fingers curled on the table until the jade seal creaked against his palm. He had the face of a man who could not yet choose whether to be a fortress or a bridge. "If this is the kind of story that keeps you awake, stay with it. Watch What happens when a single child's voice rearranges a family's plans? After the guests dispersed into polite islands of conversation, the private room where the Fu family gathered became a theater of A photograph of the late Fu matriarch presided from above, like a benevolent. The elders paced like lines on a ledger. Some faces hardened, others showed a flicker of something that might be conscience. They argued not so much about morality, as about risk. The seal on the table, unwrapped now, reflected their faces like a quiet magnifying glass. "You brought scandal into the house," the aunt said to Fusiu finally. "You already know what scandal does." "Scandal is what it is," he answered. His voice was frank. It had the dry quality of someone who'd been taught to speak in transactions. "We need certainty." "And if he is yours?" An uncle hissed. "Do you intend to accept a bastard heir? Think of the shareholders." Fu Siu's face slackened. For all his control, the past had a way of arriving like an unpaid bill. He remembered an old studio floor, the smell of turpentine and unfinished canvases, and a young woman painting a small face under a window. She had painted with a devotion that made the room seem more real. He remembered the way the painting had stayed on his desk until the first promotion came and the painting slid under stacks of papers forgotten in the shuffle of climbing. He remembered a night when they had tasted red bean buns in the rain, and he had promised to build her a future. He remembered promising, while planning an exit, "Find the woman," the aunt ordered. "Find the mother." They would find her. They would find answers, and stamp them into decisions. But answers do not always arrive ready-made. They arrive messy. Like people. The boy Fu Zhaonian, as he'd told anyone who would ask, had a name and little else. He had been living as children often do in cities that moved too fast for them, combing parks for bottles that could be exchanged for a bowl of noodles, hiding under staircases when rain made the streets unfriendly, and sleeping in corners where the world's light dimmed to manageable sizes. He had a ritual. Every week he would find a red flower an expensive thing for someone who traded glass for cent sandok. It into his pocket. He believed that 50 red flowers would make a promise true. He counted them like prayers. When he was not in a backpack, he stole small, brave things from life. He watched other families from the park bench, with the practiced look of someone who had taken aside the scene of joy, to observe it, as one observes a painting. He would sit with his knees pulled up, and watch parents teaching their children to skip stones, to tie shoelaces, to make promises. He thought often of a woman with paint on her hands, who had once made him a bowl of red bean buns, and hummed as she worked. He thought of a man who smelled of new suits and cigarettes, and who had once told him he would always have a home. He remembered a warmth that had nothing to do with weather. Those memories were a handful of fragile objects he carried like contraband. Before the event, before anyone lit the rooms with jewels and law, there had been the long abrasion of being small and accountable to nobody. There had been nights when Lena would pull back the flap of the backpack and feed him cold noodles, and tell him a story of a garden where people didn't have to stay inside bags. There had been mornings when the boy would be tucked into the pack like an offering, and the world would slide by, indifferent. Suji's life had once been a canvas. She had been a young woman with an appetite for color and a stubborn belief that a painting could hold someone's truth. She had met Fusiu in a classroom smelling of chalk and oil. He had been shy then, someone who kept ambition folded inside him like origami. They had loved in a cheap studio lit by a single bulb, their mouths full of economy and secrets. Once, in the middle of winter, she had knitted a small scarf for a child who didn't yet exist, the kind of gesture that had been both foresight and superstition. She had painted a small portrait of them on attempt to make sure memory could be held in oil frames of their life, placed on a windowsill like offerings. But when the household's weight arrived, a ring of relatives who had watched him and measured him, Fusiu had learned how to be hungry enough for power to stop tasting things. Family pressure is not a single night, it is a climate. There had been choices: a studio or stability, a promise or a transfer of responsibility. In the push of ambitions, promises frayed. Suji had been left with a pregnancy, and a thin door, labeled exit, in the form of a hospital ward she did not deserve. There had been a fall, quiet and unremarkable, in the way it changed everything. It became a rumor about fragility, and a curtain drawn across a life. Her stepfather, who had grown used to dealing with problems, as one deals with paperwork, had a talent for telling a story in a court's language, and the story he told of her wobbling mind stuck. Authorities took her like a thing misfiled. The world that had once been bright, with small paints, turned gray. People talked about instability, and about an illness that could be written on a chart. The family that once knew her as an artist had afforded her an absence. She was committed, the papers read, to an institution that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. The reason given to the public was a tale of a fragile mind. The truth whispered something different. A woman who resisted being reduced was easier to move aside than a man who had ambition and property. There was a legal apparatus that worked in favored directions. There was an absence of compassion. Suji, for a while, was erased. When she came back into the world, it was because survival had been a string stretched taut, and someone finally cut it too far. She returned with a diagnosis that could be read in the language of hospitals. A lesion in the brain, a mass that looked like tomorrow could be stripped away. Chemo and radiation made promises that were measured in probabilities. She smiled at the suggestion of surgery like someone offered a coin whose face was not fully seen. The doctor would say, softly and properly, that the operation was risky. Success was a balance of skill and chance. Failure would be a reality weighed in months and memories. The man who would hold her life in his hands. Dr. Renaud arrived with an accent and steady certainty, and a list of ways the body might not cooperate. He offered a chance, not a guarantee. It was the kind of thing you accept when you prefer a slim chance to certain decline. The timeline folded. Pregnancy, separation, confinement, illness. The child grew in a world without the woman who carried him. He was raised by absence, by a linchpin of survival, Lena's kindness, and a stubborn resourcefulness that had the taste of aluminum. When the boy crawled out of the backpack into a room full of chandeliers and wills, he did what children do. He named the person his heart wanted. He did not know contracts or social currency. He knew need and history, and the small, stubborn pattern of wanting to belong. After that night, the Fu House held a series of small, urgent meetings. The elders wanted legal certainty. The younger brothers wanted to keep reputation unblemished. The lawyers wanted samples and forms. Fu Xiu went home and sat in a quiet room, the jade seal on the table like a sun, reduced in size, its green skin reflecting a man who had to choose. In the days that followed, whispers traveled past porcelain and into classrooms, where art students painted their anonymous frustrations. Lena walked through those corridors and kept her head down. She had not intended to be a part of an aristocratic scandal. She had only wanted to give a boy a chance to breathe. The boy, when he was alone with his sliver of a world, kept his rituals. On a damp afternoon he would kneel by a stall that sold red bean buns, and hold out the only coin he had earned. The stallholder, an older woman who smelled of yeast and kindness, would slide him a warm bun, with a look that said she had done this before for those with pockets like holes. The boy would kneel on a step, and press the bun into his mouth, as if each bite were a sentence written into his future. He kept a list in his head. Find mother, ask father, collect 50 red flowers. He did not understand legalese. He only understood memory's way of knitting itself back to life. In a cheap room, above a noodle place, Suji Yi painted when energy allowed. Her hands were still capable of seeing color in places the eyes could not find. She painted men and women, in small gestures, someone holding a hand, someone putting a mug down gently. Sometimes she would wake up and not remember who had been in the painting before. Other times a face would bloom like a floodlight, and she would remember the laugh of a small boy. The hospital had taken memories with a greedy hand snatches, time slices, that could be replaced by other people's voices. It was a kind of theft that left an ache shaped like a missing tooth. When she learned her diagnosis in a fluorescent-lit room, there were moments she was surrendered to the clinical language of months and survival curves. She listened to the word surgery as if it could be threaded into a sentence and made softer. The doctor, Dr. Lin, who was careful with human moods, lifted his hands from a tray of reports and looked at her as if he were deciding how to tell a child about thunder. "There is a repair we can attempt," he said gently, "but it is complex. There is risk to speaking, to memory. We counsel honestly. Some patients do well, some do not." Her sister-in-law's eyes had that old legal look that stained all hope with ledger lines. "We need to consider finances," she said. "We need to think of the child's future." The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and burned coffee. Suji thought of 50 red flowers and knitted scarves, and the way a face could be made present again. With a single touch, she wanted to make promises to a boy she barely remembered in a way that the world could understand. She wanted to hold him and be real. At the Fu house, the longer things remained unresolved, the more enemies sprouted like mushrooms. An uncle suggested quietly that a private adoption might be the cleanest solution transaction that moved the boy into a different orbit and kept the fusia. Another voice suggested a DNA test under watchful cameras, a spectacle that would deliver a verdict to the tabloids and lift gossip like a wave. Nobody suggested the boy's welfare first, because family empires are constructed in the language of risk and reward. In the alley behind the noodle shop where Lena sometimes slept, 2 men in plain clothes watched the street. They were not family men. They were men who had been paid to observe children and rotate rumors. They lit cheap cigarettes and spoke of a jade seal as if it were a prize in a theology of numbers. "If there's even a chance he's Fu, the offer will be made," one of them said. Their words slid into the world like rain. Lena didn't care about shares or press. She cared about the boy, his hunger, the way he tilted his head when he asked if the world would keep him. She had been poor once, and without options, she had learned how to be brave. Out of necessity, she had known Suji Yi years before, when they both burned paint and energy in the same low-ceilinged room. There had been an unspoken sisterhood between artists and survivors. Lena climbed into the backpack in part out of a promise she made to herself never to let a child be abandoned to cold pavements. When the Fu household arranged to have the child temporarily placed in their Quran arrangement that whispered the word custody, but held it back with legal teeth, Lena handed him over, and felt her body forget how to hold herself. The boy clung to her like a small animal to a heat source. "You'll find Mom," she promised. "We'll find her." The Fu family wrapped the boy in clothes from a wardrobe not meant for him. Blue suits had a way of making him look like a miniature official. Photographs appeared online and in morning shows. The boy standing under a lamp, the jade seal on the table behind him, a woman's face captured in some frame who could be called mother by some and stranger by others. Fusu watched those images and felt his life divide. Part of him was the man who knew how to navigate a boardroom and a press release. Another part of him remembered paint on canvases and a thinner life. He called the studios where Sujihi had last painted. He sent a car to the hostile addresses he had once known. The house moved like an organism arranging its attack and defense. Exuji. Doro. When she heard a rumor about her son first as a grain and then as a wave, felt an ache that was physical and immediate. Her hands shook. She could not name all the edges of her memory, but she knew the shape of a small mouth and the promise she had once whispered into air. She wanted to get out of the bed the hospital had given her and run through streets that terrified her. She wanted to claim what she had borne. The doctor said she would need strength for what might come, and Dr. Ren touched down in the city with a passport and a reputation of her choices in medical language that allowed for a tiny optimism, not foolhardy, but human. He set percentages on the table and cradled them like something brittle. "We can try," he said. "But we must be ready for the consequences. Memory is delicate. The brain keeps certain parts like locked rooms." He did not promise miracles. He promised expertise and a careful plan. That was all any sane person could ask. Meanwhile, the boy wandered through rooms rearranged by adult calculations. He learned the rhythms of a house that measured time and meetings and etiquette. He learned the sound of a door closing and measuring the sound for whether kindness lived beyond it. He learned to notice small things like the pattern of a carpet and the shape of a hand. He kept his ritual of red flowers, though in the house red blossoms were less readily found. He hid the few he could collect in a dent of a room where he thought no one would look. Tension built, like pressure before a storm. The family would have to decide whether to test his blood, the lowman in the market would say. Whether the jade seal's future would be attached to his name. Fusu found himself caught between a ledger's rationality and a small, stubborn echo from a past that made the present messy. The first night the boy slept in a room with better heating, he dreamed of a woman staining her fingers with paint. She leaned over him and hummed as she knitted a scarf with clumsy stitches, and he woke with the sense that somewhere a promise had been left. In the morning he folded the scarf's edge into his palm and went to find Lena, who was already awake and waiting with a bowl of lukewarm noodles. Lena set the bowl near him and touched the little scar on his knee. With the same curiosity, "A seamstress reads fabric. We'll find her," she said again, though it had begun to sound like a question she posed to keep her own courage. The boy nodded. He had mostly stopped understanding the language of adult fear but had learned to decipher hope. As the stories spread, allies formed. A nurse from a community clinic, who once knew Sue G's work, heard a rumor, and arrived with paint-smudged hands, and the quiet flame of someone who believed that art made people more than ledger entries. A park ant who sold flowers suspended a small weekly red blossom for the boy on the promise of a story. A toy factory agent, moved by the sight of such a small person standing under a chandelier, offered a small job for Lena. If she would agree, small acts aggregated into a fragile scaffolding, but a pressure worked in the other direction. Those who had everything to lose weighed the boy's existence in shares. The Fu family board whispered that if the boy were legally acknowledged as blood, certain trusteeships would shift. The aunt insisted. This must be prevented. The family's reputation could not be allowed to wobble. Human beings are never only moral creatures, they are economic ones too. Money is not always rude. Often, it's a language of survival. In a chapter of The House That Smelled of Old Books and Stricter Decisions, Fusu sat alone and traced the jade seal's carving with the fingertip. The emblem was an old thing, its edges worn by generations. His finger found the indentation where each owner had pressed a thumb. A list of names that were part instruction and part ritual. He thought about the possibility of a child who might bear his blood, and what that would do to the neat scaffolding of his life. He thought of the night he had walked away from a small studio, and what hunger had tasted like then. He thought of Suji's painting of a face in a window, and for a moment, quiet broke into him. The man who built a career out of ambition felt himself confronted with a truth that was messy and undesired and impossibly human. He had to choose. That choice would ripple. There were threats, 2 messages left at Lena's door, with polite threats and veiled offers. A car that followed her down a wet lane one night, until she ducked into a lightless doorway. Someone suggested simply buying the child's silence. Someone else suggested a discreet placement in a foreign care home. Every solution smelt of compromise. The next week the Fu legal team arranged for the child to have a discreet medical exam. Nothing dramatic, they said. Just a sample for paternity, a few photographs, an administrative check. Lena signed documents with a trembling hand. She wanted only what was best for the child, and found herself juggling a world that had no category for a small boy's right to a future. When the nurse took a small lock of the boy's hair, he stared at the clinical instruments and thought of a painting brush. Is that how they make sure you're mine? He asked simply. Everyone in the room held their breath. A DNA swab, polite and sterile, was not a verdict, but a hinge. Days passed in a peculiar limbo. An exchange of documents, home visits, small honors, like being given a proper bed. Fusu made choices in stages. He did not sign anything final without measuring the cost. He visited the boy under the pretense of official oversight and found himself teaching the child how to fold paper into boat shapes. The child took to him with the inexorable speed of young hearts. There were moments when Fusu would look at the boy and think he could rewrite the ledger, if he only dared, but the past's shadow grew longer. The story of Su Ji-yi in a hospital, and of her precarious brain lesion, reached the family and the press in blunted fragments. She sent a letter that Lena found tucked into the canvas Toto letter with smudged paint and a few words that made the world reconfigure. The letter read like a painting, jagged, honest, and true, in its imperfect way. If he calls you Dad, one sentence said, tell him, I tried. The news of the mother's illness made some of the family's harder hearts pucker. They saw a risk, certainly, but they also saw the possibility of a narrative that could be controlled. The board met again. Not about morality, but about optics. Whoever held the boy's future would also hold the narrative that made the house's heirs look humane. And somewhere between small tights and big ledgers, someone leaned toward a dangerous conclusion. If the boy was indeed the key to the seal, then his body would become an object in a long game. That thought settled into action. People who kept score began drafting strategies that involved lawyers and proposandrefuse meetings. They intended to acquire not just a child, but the justification for shifting fortune. On a rainy afternoon, while Fusu prepared to speak with legal counsel, the boy wandered to the house's inner garden, and found a small flower bed, where a single red blossom had been placed a deposit from the parkont. He sat and counted it as if it were a currency of love, careful and measured. He took it and placed it under his pillow that night, which would surprise a man accustomed to ledgers. The boy saved a petal like someone who America's great poets would say was saving weather. As the house debated, the hospital prepared. Dr. Ren called, with a tone that had late-night urgency tucked into its words. There was a plan to bring Suji to a hospital where the surgery could be performed, if she consented. The operation would be complicated. The team would walk a tightrope around language centers and memory niches. He made it plain. Outcomes varied. Memory could be altered like a picture left in sunlight. He asked for consent, for openness, for an acceptance of uncertainty. The choice, finally, would be Fusiu's. To help shape, he could sign documents allowing her to join her son if she wished, offer guardianship, or turn the child into a political pawn. He could make the seat of power, a place where love might occupy the gaps that ambition had left, or he could protect the house by enforcing distance. On the evening before the operation was to be discussed publicly, Fusu walked by the desk where the jade seal lay like a small planet. His hand hovered. He did not know which was braver, to pull the boy into the family and accept the tumult, or to protect the house's stability by letting the child be quietly placed elsewhere. He thought of the red bean bun the boy loved, and of a woman with paint on her hands. He thought too of the life he had built, and the family that had expected him to keep it untarnished. He alone stood between ledger and longing, and the child slept that night in a bed that smelled of new sheets. A red flower under his pillow, a wrapped scarf, whose stitches were lopsided but warm. He dreamed of a woman humming, of 50 red flowers arranged into a crown, and of a man who would, perhaps, one day answer him with a name rather than a contract. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and enormous. Inside, decisions took root, like seeds. The next morning, when the legal team arrived with documents, and the hospital called to confirm logistics, someone knocked on Lena's door hard enough to rattle the cheap glass. Men with polite faces and hard eyes asked questions, like they were inventorying a property. A message slid through the floorboards. There were people prepared to buy silence, to move children under the guise of care. Negotiations that had the smell of money at their base took shape in the air. That was when a shadow from the family's edge moved toward Lena, with a promise that had no name for kindness. "We will ensure the boy's future, if you cooperate." Cooperation, the message implied, meant leaving the child and allowing the house to return to its quiet routines. The offer was another form of calculation. A price was set. The boy's small life suddenly had a ledger attached to it. Lena refused, as fiercely as the poor can refuse when conscience and a child's face are on the line. She spoke in a voice that had practiced being stubborn. "He will not be a thing for sale," she said. "Not for any of you." Sometimes the poor outrun calculation by refusing the vocabulary of bargains. Sometimes they surrender to it because survival makes compromise necessary. Lena, who had never known safety, refused this time. She would rather fight. Word of her refusal arrived in the family by a messenger who had the look of someone who prefers small wins. They had already commissioned a temporary guardianship hearing. The house would move next to perform routine legalities. Suji-yi listened to these currents in the hospital when she could keep coherent. The news unsettled her more than the diagnosis. She refused, quietly and stubbornly, to be an arrangement. She wanted to be known on her own terms. She refused, quietly and stubbornly, to be an arrangement. She wanted to be known on her own terms. Her sentences in the hospital had become small battlements, short, firm, carved out of necessity. When nurses asked about consent forms, she pressed the pen like a declaration. When staff came with hospital pamphlets, she folded them into a shape that made sense. A doorway, an argument against being erased. The week that followed felt like a tilt toward a precipice. Legal papers multiplied at the Fu residence. Meetings convened around a long table, where charts replaced portraits, and risk assessments replaced memory. Fusiu moved among them with the same economy he used for business decisions, yet every night he returned to an empty room, and stared at the jade seal. As if it might answer personal questions, his board never asked aloud. At the hospital, Dr. Ren held a folder of scans under light, and explained the operation again, slowly and plainly. He was patient in a way that had nothing to do with technique, and everything to do with people who stood on the edge of hope. "We can remove much of the mass," he said. "We can attempt to preserve eloquent cortex language, facial recognition, but the brain is unpredictable. Memory is not guaranteed. We are buying time, perhaps clarity. We are not buying a script where everything goes back to where it was. We have to accept that the patient who comes out may not be the same in all the ways you hope. Odds." Fusiu's voice came from the doorway when he arrived to see Suji, in a pale afternoon that smelled of antiseptic and boiled coffee. He watched the exchange like a man watching a storm find a coastline. 40, maybe 50%, for a significant reduction of tumor burden, Dr. Ren said, without flourish. Comorbidities alter that. In this case, the risk of deficits in language or memory is real. We must be prepared for a range of outcomes. Fusu folded and refolded the statement like a receipt. His inner ledger tried to translate 40% into a decision. He asked the practical duration of hospital stay, rehabilitation needs, costs. The numbers arrived crisp and impersonal enough to be manageable. The human side rearranged themselves, like furniture he no longer recognized. Elsewhere, the house's political rot deepened. The aunt who had first sharpened her nails over the jade seal called meetings that smelled of print and polished wood. "We must control the narrative," she said, her voice smooth like lacquer. "If we allow her to return as unstable, if we allow sympathies, then the board will be compromised. Think. Trusteeship changes. Requests for oversight. It is immoral to treat a woman's life as a PR exercise," countered a younger brother who remembered the old stories about the family's beginnings. The argument did not rest on tenderness. It rested on calculation flavored by a memory that sometimes softened in private. People were not wholly cruel here, they were complicated. As the DNA of ambition tends to be. Lena found herself increasingly alone in a small apartment that still smelled faintly of noodles and canvas. Men in plain suits began to appear with polite offers that were, in truth, negotiations by foreign placements. Promises to do the boy a favor if she agreed to sign. The offers were the language of charity and the shape of trade. She refused them all. Late one night, after a day of exchanges that left Lena near trembling, someone left a photograph on her doorstep. It was a blurred image taken from a poorly angled camera showing the boy walking with a man in plain clothes. Someone had followed him, the photo said, without words, that the boy could be moved. It said the house had resources enough to trade safety for convenience. Lena swallowed the fear and pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window, until sleep came like a thin blanket. A legal hearing moved fast and efficient. The judge, a woman with a small face and a slow temper, listened to lawyers who used best interest as both shield and sword. Lena arrived with ink on her hands from paint she sometimes used to keep her muscles learning. She spoke softly and fiercely, telling the judge of nights in stairwells, and of the warmth of sharing a bowl of noodles. She said, simply, "He calls me Aunt Lena. I keep him safe." The Fu Families Council argued the opposite. The house could provide stability, schooling, healthcare. The boy's potential connection to the Jade Seal clouded the air like steam. The judge weighed evidence, read the boy's circumstances as if reading a ledger, and made a temporary decision. The Fu household would assume provisional guardianship while paternity tests were completed. It was pragmatic, common, and cold, the kind of ruling that arranged care under surveillance. Lena agreed to the provisional order, insisting only that she'll be allowed regular visits. She had no illusions, she only wanted the boy to be protected, until the truth could be known. The solution did not satisfy everyone. Men with unchecked ambition do not like waiting. A plan formed not all at once, but in two-way calls, and in the whisper of money. Meeting motive. There were those who thought it simpler to remove the factor entirely. If the boy disappeared from the equation, the house could maintain its present order. It was not a moral calculus, merely a logistical one. On a humid Friday, the house sent a liaison, with a polite face, to pick the boy up for a supervised park outing, a ploy to make his days seem ordinary. While there, counsel completed paperwork. Lena accompanied him to the entrance, packed a small bag with his ritual comforts, the lopsided scarf, the few red petals he kept fresh in a dent of his pocket. The boy hummed a tune he had learned from a stallholder who sold red bean buns. They walked through the park, where the city seemed to exhale. The boy wanted to show off how he could fold paper boats that sailed straight. He handed one to a child who giggled. For a minute, the world was simple, as a painting with a single stroke. Then plain men slid from the trees, like an ugly shadow. They were quick, efficient hands that had been trained in taking. One lunged for the boy. Lena pushed, screamed. The liaison, startled, was a half-step behind her plan. A small scuffle curled through hedge and grass. Someone shouted. People turned. The boy began to cry honest, small, piercing sound that spread through the park like a ribbon of noise. A car idled nearby. Men in suits sprang. A door opened, and a figure older known, a man who had the kind of face that made lines go still, stepped out. It was Fusu. He had been at the house, had seen no evidence of an abduction plan, but when the phone call came, one of those calls that rends the fabric of orderly daysine, had moved without deliberation. He pushed through sweating, heat, and people with a speed that felt like a reconnection. When he reached Lena and the boy, two of the plain men had their hands on the child's shoulders. Without thinking, without bored minutes, Fusu stepped between them. He did not speak in businessese. He spoke in a small, raw voice that belonged to something much older than his suit. let him go. One of the men smirked. Orders came from above, where to bring him away. Fusiu's response was not a negotiation. He yanked a badge from his jacket as if it were proof of the authority he had, both legal and personal, and said, "You are not taking him." The men hesitated. The morning sun made lines across Fusio's face, and for a second there was an image of the man who had once left a studio for a life of careful measures. He imagined himself older, a man who could measure loss on spreadsheet, but he did not like the way this theft made the boy's cry nest in his ribs. A brawl broke out, small, ugly, brief. Bystanders gathered. Someone called the police. The men retreated, with zippers of threats that promised other attempts. Save for bruises that would show later, the boy was returned to Lena's arms. People clapped in little bursts, the way crowds do when they do not know what else to do. Fusiu stood with his shirt rumpled and his collar loose, and when the boy looked up at him, something that had been an abstract memory became a live possibility. The attempted abduction became an evidence strand the couple of people in the house, who had kept pity in their pockets, used like a weapon. The aunt who had sharpened her nails found herself exposed when CCTV footage of the park appeared on a phone passed between committee members. The footage was grainy, but telling. A black sedan used by a private security contractor registered on a ledger, payments traced through a middleman tied to an entity with board members who had access to emergency funds. A wire traced where greed had slipped into a plan. Fusio's power could be used to cover, to pay off, to cut corners. He did none of those things. He called for an internal investigation, and in an act that surprised everyone who had remembered him as a man of tidy separations, he ordered the House Legal Office to hand findings to the police. Some people in the family considered this madness. Why burn bridges and create enemies? His answer was deceptively simple. The boy had a right to be safe, far beyond any ledger. The backlash was immediate. The aunt and a cousin who had coordinated the hiring of the plain men were furious, and for a while appeared to move like a split faction in the house. They argued that Fusu had betrayed the family. He told them, in a meeting so quiet the paper seemed to lean forward, that he had not betrayed the family. He had redefined what the family would be. When the investigation concluded, it uncovered harsh whispers of complicity and filings that pointed to embezzlement. The aunt was removed from certain trusteeships. The cousin lost positions he had used to broker deals. The family's reputation was bruised. Not all of them were prosecuted. Old family networks are adept at smoothing rough things into softer things, but the message was clear. Some lines would not be crossed. The turn of events shifted the house's dynamics. The jade seal, once merely a symbol of authority, became a relic of a place that could choose compassion over expedience. Fusiu, for all his learned coolness, had chosen to act like a man who could not sleep with a small child's cry in his ears. He began to spend hours near the hospital waiting room, hovering like someone discovering a new discipline. Presence. The day the surgery was scheduled, the waiting room looked like a gathering of all the house's stakes. Grandmothers sat knitting with a nervous intensity, counting thread as if it were prayer. Aunts adjusted their scarves. Board members arrived with faces that said they had been rehearsing optimism in front of mirrors. Lena sat near the end of a row, hands folded, the boy's small paper boat stacked beside her petty talismans of a life that might change. Dr. Ren walked the corridor like a man who had rehearsed every eventuality, and still felt the weight of the unknown on his back. He met Fusu in a corridor lit by harsh fluorescent light. Their conversation was brisk, clinical, full of probability. "We will do our best," Dr. Ren said. "But be prepared. The risk to language function, and possibly to recognizable episodic memory, is real. Post-op care will matter as much as the operation itself." Fusiu nodded. He had read numbers enough to understand them. He also knew, in the marrow of his bones now, that some things were not worth measuring in percentages. He had, that morning, sat with the boy and taught him how to fold a paper boat into a simple heart. The smallness of it had rewired some of the scales in him. He signed consent forms and power allocations that allowed Soo Ji-hee to have the surgery and receive care without conditions. He did it not as a public gesture but as a private surrender to what he feared losing more: the possibility of being less without her. The operation started with a silence held by 100 small people. Nurses moved like dancers. Monitors blinked. The boy, allowed into the corridor, under supervision, stood on tiptoe, and pressed his face against the small glass that looked into the pre-op bay. He looked at the woman who had knitted a scarf she could not yet remember making, and mouthed a single word she might not yet comprehend: Mom. He did not know about the maps of the brain, or the way surgeries carve histories. He only knew that his hands wanted to reach through the glass and touch her. Inside the operating room, the team worked with precision. Scalpels met scalp, screens lit in pale blues and greens. Dr. Ren's voice was calm, controlled, an odd mixture of surgeon and poet who refused to flatter hope. Hours stretched into a thin line on the monitor. The tumor's edges were less distinct than a textbook would like. The brain resisted at points, as if to remind the team of its autonomy. At one point, monitors dipped. Heart rate slowed. Pale alarms spoke in beeps that made all present hold their breath, like an audience at a tightrope. A nurse hustled. Dr. Ren's hands became translation action for the anxious, unreadable prayers of the waiting room. For a span that felt like a lifetime, the outcome teetered. It was not a miracle in the flashy sense. It was the product of skill, of stubbornness, of quick corrective measures, of an assistant who anticipated a complication and moved before the alarm, fully finished, saying its name. When the steady rhythm returned to the monitors, it came with a cost. Dr. Ren candidly warned that there would be recovery, rehabilitation, uncertainty, and gaps. We've taken as much as we could without crossing into regions that would guarantee loss, he said to Fusu when he emerged, hair flattened and eyes tired. She will sleep now. We will monitor for swelling, for infection. We took a chunk. That chunk could have been causing some of her symptoms weakness. Perhaps, but we must be mindful. Memory may be patchy. Some things may come back with therapy. Cues, smell, and taste. Other things may be gone, or reorganized. The boy, who had spent the operation time with his hands in his pockets and a cup of stale candy in his mouth, burst into tears when the surgeon walked by. He threw his arms around a nurse's leg and said, with all the eloquence of small people, "Is she okay right now?" Dr. Ren said softly, bending down so his voice would be received like a gift. "We have her. That is the most we can promise." The days after the operation were slow and full of small battles. Suji slept with an expression that shifted between concentration and complaint. She would wake and look at the world with a pleasantly confused face. Sometimes she recognized things immediately. The knitted scarf on her bedside table, the jade green of the seal someone had placed nearby like a totem. Occasionally, her fingers seemed to remember paint even when her speech did not. Other times, she blinked and looked at the child and called him a stranger, then apologized with the quick humility of someone who owned the shame of confusion like an unwanted visitor. Memory came back, in fragments. A smell red bean paste warming by a vendor would make her mouth form a small shape of recognition. The sound of someone humming a tune from years ago would unspool a face behind her eyes for a breath. She could not always find names. Her hands, however, seemed to have more direct lines to recognition. They could recall the motion of stirring paint. They could hold a brush with the same little stubborn force that had given birth to early canvases. The child, who understood the world and rituals, found ways to coax memory. He sat by the bedside and pressed warm red bean buns against the mattress in a ritual performed as if offering something sacred. He lined up paper boats and presented them like a cord of small objects meant for persuasion. He would bring the scarf close to her face and say, "This is what you made." She would sometimes close her eyes and smile, and sometimes shake her head and whisper, "I'm sorry." The way a person apologizes to both the present and the past. Outside the hospital, the house's dynamics continued to rearrange. Those who had once been loud in opposition to the boy's presence found themselves cautious. The aunt who had once advocated for spectacle retreated from trusteeship after a string of press inquiries and a private scandal about hiring private agents. Public opinion had turned. Charity streams and local social workers were not yet a tsunami, but the optics mattered. The house, always sensitive to its reflection, began to reframe its image. Fusio's actions changed slowly into habit. He started visiting the hospital daily, at first as penance, then as something closer to desire. He read stories to the child in a way that felt foreign at first hands. Unsure how to make paper boats into hearts, but soon, with a steadiness that surprised him, he taught the boy how to fold himself into a corner of a sofa and how to balance a coin on a paper temple. The boy, for his part, gave him small gifts. A single red petal, saved under a pack of cards, a paper boat folded into a tiny envelope. Gradually, a legal resolution was crafted, careful, literate, and mindful of optics that allowed Lena continued visitation, and created a guardianship framework that also provided for Suji's ongoing rehabilitation. Fusio established a trust on unglamorous but practical thing to fund the woman's care, the boy's schooling, and the rehabilitation program. It was rational and full of feeling, a compromise between the house's old language of ledgers and the new language of human cost. The family punished some actors publicly and quietly settled with others. The aunt was removed from several positions and publicly admonished. The cousin who had coordinated the attempted abduction found himself under investigation. He lost his seat on the board and, with it, his ability to engineer quiet solutions. The house looked different after these purgings, not morally clean, not entirely redeemed, but altered in ways that made future calculations slightly more complicated. The slow work of memory therapy began in earnest. Occupational therapists came with boxers of familiar instruments, jars with spice smells, photographs labeled with dates, canvases blank and waiting. They used the ritual of painting to smooth cognitive edges. Paint stretched over canvas offered paths for narrative to wind back into place. Suji disliked, for a while, being healed into someone defined by a diagnosis. She threw temper tantrums at the sight of simple spelling lists, and insisted on painting without instruction. But the therapists were patient. They let her paint until she wore out, and then, gently, they built lessons into the rhythm of what she loved. They used scents peeling an orange, offering the smell of toasted sesame dough, pull threads of memory. They asked her to bake a red bean bun with someone and watch the edges of recognition bloom like little green shoots. One afternoon, while she painted the light falling on a small bowl of red bean paste, she looked up and recognized the way the boy chewed his bun. The recognition was spare and fragile, a flash of warmth that traveled up through her chest and landed in a place that did not have a name yet. She put down her brush and walked to the window. Fusio was there, standing like a man who had learned the strange grammar of parenthood and power at once. Their eyes met across a distance that felt like an ocean. When she finally spoke his name, it was like a pebble thrown at a glass. It made a sound that rippled. Sue. The word was small, honest, and not at all like a proclamation. He felt it like the start of an argument he did not want to end. It was the beginning of reconciliation without a script. They did not return to the life they had before. Stories do not unwind in neat reels. But they learned new habits. Fusio took to bringing her paintbrushes and oil cups to the hospital, and would sit for hours, doing nothing but company. He learned to make tea in a slow way that had nothing to do with the calendar and everything to do with being there. They built new rituals, intentionally. Sunday mornings became painting mornings. Thursdays were for reading aloud. The boy taught them both how to fold a paper boat into a heart anew each week. The boy kept collecting red flowers. He never managed to get to 50. Sometimes he arrived at 30, and then stopped. Content for that week, he would press the petals in a book and offer them like a peace treaty. The knitted scarf she had once sewed in a moment of absent-minded superstition at stitches, awkward, but warm, became a symbol of weathered love, when the woman recognized it, and remembered making it only in pieces. The jade seal, which had once been a commodity, now sat in an unlocked drawer where the boy could see it. One afternoon he found it and, with careful fingers, placed it gently inside the scarf, as if securing it for warmth. There were other adjustments. The aunt who had once measured morality by the width of her nails left the household's inner councils, but not without slowly softening in private. She came, one day, to the hospital, with a small paper boat at her hand, and left it on Sugi's bedside. It was a beginning of apology. Fusiu watched her do this with a man who had begun to measure a different kind of profit, not revenue, but relation. Weeks turned into months. The boy began school, in a small classroom that smelled of crayons. He learned how to write his name carefully, and discovered the pleasure of teacher praise. He still folded paper boats. Sometimes he put a small petal inside, and waved it at the window as if sending a message. He still asked sometimes if the man in the suit would stay. Fusiu would answer him honestly, "I will try." That word trying was a practical, steady kind of vow. When Suji left the hospital for the first long day that she would spend away from 4 lines, she walked into the Fu house with a stroller of supplies and a head full of colors. The room smelled of old wood and oranges. Somewhere in the house, a kettle boiled. She found a small room arranged for her with an easel and a stack of canvases. The family had made room. Some had done so out of obligation. Others had done so out of changed hearts. Her first painting after the operation was not a portrait of the past. She painted the kitchen table where the boy folded paper boats. She painted the way light fell across his folded hands, the scarf bunched at his knee, and the jade seal glinting like an unassuming star. The painting, when finished, had a peculiar honesty. Strokes that retraced memory, and strokes that invented new shapes. People were not cured by a single act of surgery or one admission of guilt. Some members of the family remained bitter. Some refused to appear at dinners, where the child sat at the table. The aunt, who had been removed from trusteeship, found somewhere to live quietly, and painted in a small, private way that made her less shrill. The cousin who had been investigated began working at a low-level firm, learning how to live without making the world bend. There were legal threads to untangle. Paternity tests eventually returned and were incontrovertible. Blood did not lie. The legal codicil that governed the Seoul succession had to be Fusiu, practical as ever, chose to adjust the will to provide for all heirs, while creating a specific trust for the child's welfare, education, and care. He did not write himself out of history. He wrote a clause that allowed the boy to be cared for, without becoming the center of a corporate takeover. It was an awkward, generous thing. A compromise between duty to blood and duty to moral clarity. The final confrontation with the people who had tried to buy the boy's silence was not cinematic in a way tabloids would like. It was a meeting at which accountants produced balances and a law firm read charges. The cousin's hands tightened as he saw paperwork that meant other kinds of loss. There were apologies given that were not particularly repentant. Sentences that felt like social algebra. The house moved on. But, quieter now. The noises of greed, damped by the presence of a small boy, who kept offering paper boats to guests. Time curdled, and then stretched again. The boy kept his rituals. Suji kept painting. Fusiu kept present more often than not, in the small ways that make up living. Boiling water, repairing a paper boat crease, when a fold was clumsy, driving to school pickups, when obligations allowed. He learned a new language of presence. The child began to call him Dad sometimes. Sometimes he called him by the more cautious term he had invented. Mr. Fu. Both were accepted. Memory remained a mosaic for Suji. Some days she woke, and the world fit like a glove. Other days there were gaps she could not name. She would sometimes look at a photo, and not know whether it was of her past, or someone else's. But the emotional weather of the house changed. Where once contracts had been the dominant grammar, the room now practiced small, repetitive rituals, meant to practice love. Fusu and Suji would sit with knitting needle. She sometimes remembered how to cast a stitch, and he learned to tighten the yarn properly and in the motion of making something together. They built a new vocabulary. One evening, some months after the operation, the family hosted a small gathering. Not a matchmaking night, nor a boardroom event, but a modest celebration of recovery and small reconciliations. The chandeliers' constellations were absent. Instead, there were strings of simple lights. The jade seal sat on a low table, unwrapped. Not as a trophy, but as an heirloom. The child wore a faded backpack. He had insisted on bringing, a relic of those first days when he would crawl into a pack to find warmth. Guests milled and laughed awkwardly. Someone brought red bean buns. The boy sat down at the edge of the room and, remembering the first night in the ballroom, slipped his hand into the pack, not to hide, but to find a paper boat he had made and stashed away. He pulled forth 2 small petals and threaded them onto a piece of yarn. He looked up and saw his mother across the room, painting a small picture of a bowl of buns. He crawled out of the backpack, this time onto a low cushion, climbed to his feet, and said, with the same small, brave voice he had used months ago, "Dad." The room quieted, not with the breathless hush of scandal, but with something older and softer. Recognition. Fusu, who had once stood in a house of mirrors, felt a simplicity, like a new bone. He walked to the boy and knelt down, not as a man performing a duty, but as someone learning how to be present for a small person who had already taught him more than any ledger could. He reached out and gently took the boy's hand. "Always," he said. The word was small and honest, and the boy's face, for a moment, smoothed into an expression that matched the piece of a finished painting. Later, when the house had calmed and the lights dimmed, the jade seal was placed into a small wooden box and wrapped in the knitted scarf Sujiahe, made in shaky stitches. They did it together. The woman who painted, the man who used to measure the world in spreadsheets, and a small boy, with red petals in his pocket. The scarf tucked around the seal seemed absurd in its tenderness, a symbol, once used to hollow out a child's future, now protected like a talisman against future cold. There were no fairy tale endings. Memory would not be fully restored in a neat sweep. There would be therapy sessions, regression, new recollections that returned, and old ones that did not. The family's repairs were not perfect. Some fractures remained visible, but the arc of greed had been softened by a sequence of choices, some brave, some practical, that changed the way people voted in future meetings, who got what title and where trust funds would be placed. In the quiet that followed, the boy continued to collect red flowers. He never announced when he had reached 50 numbers had become less crucial over time, but slowly, without ceremony, he filled a small jar on a windowsill with petals. The jar glowed in the afternoon light, like a small, daily miracle. Sometimes he would hand a petal to his mother, and she would breathe. And if words failed, their hands learned how to speak. On a rainy afternoon, sometime after, the boy crawled out from his backpack again, not to expose a scandal, but to surprise a friend. He clambered out onto the sofa, wrapped the knitted scarf around his shoulders, and placed the jade seal carefully in the middle of a paper boat. He looked up at Fusu, and then at Suji, and smiled. The smile was not an end, but a promise. Fusu leaned forward and took the boat. He placed the seal near him on the coffee table and, with the uncertain tenderness of someone making new vows, he said, "We will keep this together." Suji put her hand over his. She did not remember every detail of the life they had once planned, but she remembered enough. The small rituals, the red bean buns. The way a paper boat could carry a secret across water. She remembered the sound of the child calling for a father, and the way that calling forced decisions into being. Outside, city rain pattered like applause. Inside, the three of them messy, vulnerable, imperfect made a small circle. It felt like a beginning, in the honest sense of the word. Not erasure, not a perfect reunification, but the slow work of making a life worth keeping. If this story reached you and left a mark, share it with someone who needs to remember that small acts can change large things.